and welcome to the SMEC AI LearnCast. I'm your host, Steve. We're here in Melbourne, and today we'll be discussing AI and the implications for privacy, security, and sovereignty. I want to start with a question. What if the data that you had was also your company's biggest vulnerability? We're going to explore that today in the context of those three domains of privacy, security, and sovereignty. It was only a few short years ago that ChatGPT came onto the market and gave access to hundreds of millions of people to large language models. Now, these large language models have fundamentally changed the way that society operates, it's changed the way that businesses operate, and it's provided a new realm for both individuals, organizations, governments around the world to understand how they adapt to that technology. This technology has probably been one of the largest changes to the landscape since the invention of the internet itself. Joining me on the show today is Vaughan Shanks, the founder and CEO of Cydarm Technologies, a Melbourne-based cybersecurity company that has developed its own case management software. So welcome, Vaughan, and curious to hear your story of your journey of founding Cydarm Technologies and what brings you here.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to be here. A bit about my background. I'm a software engineer. I actually did a PhD in machine learning, completed in 2004, which is obviously a long way behind the current state of the art in AI, but somewhat related. Since then, I've worked as a software engineer across mostly defense and national security in a public sector and private sector capacity before starting Cydarm, which is a cybersecurity incident response management platform. So we make software that's used by security operations centers in government and critical infrastructure.
Thank you for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to your insights on. As we stand at this point, it's become undeniably clear that the single most valuable and vulnerable part of this is your data. Now, that data may include pictures of loved ones, it may include your business data, your sales data, your CRM data, which has tremendous value in it, but is also highly vulnerable. So by the end of this episode, we'll aim to give you a clear understanding of the risks of using AI and also what you can do to mitigate against those risks. To understand the landscape of AI and sovereignty, Vaughan, I have a couple of questions for you I'd like to get your input on. Firstly, how does AI operate? What makes AI so powerful?
Yeah, so it's technology that's actually been around since it was invented in about the 1960s. And I did a computer science degree in the 90s, and we actually learned about AI. And at the time, it really felt like it was old school tech. What's changed is that storage devices have become bigger, memories have become bigger, processors have become faster. We now have hardware acceleration for doing vector calculations. And all of this has made AI suddenly more viable than it used to be. So we've had machine learning for a very long time, doing recognition of objects in videos, doing speech recognition, speech to text. You could buy software for speech to text back in the 1990s. But what's really different in this iteration, there's two major things. Firstly, generative AI has come to the fore. So that's where you're effectively using these large language models to generate a string of tokens or a string of data. And then the second thing is that OpenAI, through the release of their ChatGPT client, which I think was intended as a public-facing demo, accidentally started this wave of enthusiasm, which has had this flywheel effect of having more investment. So the technology has progressed further, and it's turned into a white-hot competition to see who can build best AI.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. I do remember at university myself, for example, one of my projects was about acoustic echo cancellation. And this was, it started in Bell Labs in the US. It was talking about, it was machine learning to reduce the amount of echo you hear in a receiver in a conference room, not too dissimilar to this, which was very much like you said, the first use case of machine learning. And to see now with OpenAI and ChatGPT evolving that and the use case being much broader, it's absolutely changed the landscape of use cases and brought it to everyone's attention.
I think so, but part of that is that I think many of the use cases that are being used for are actually not appropriate. People are, someone with a hammer thinks everything is a nail. And while I think large language models or generative AI in the broader sense have a lot of utility, there are some things it just can't do very well. People are running up against the edge of that. So really we've got a massive advance in the frontier of what technology can do, but it's a very jagged frontier. It's not evenly distributed across all that.
Yeah, so given where AI started with machine learning models and where it's now got to, do you think we've potentially jumped a couple of hoops and it's been used as this multi-purpose Swiss Army knife, if you will?
I think we've made very large incremental improvements. I think the faster and larger compute hardware that we have has enabled us to run these massive, massive models, which means you can effectively train on data from the entire internet, every publication ever made, and you can boil it down into a giant matrix or several giant matrices of floating point numbers. So in a way, it's a kind of compression, but it's compression that's predictive in the sense that I can ask it a question and it will complete my question with an answer that has perfect grammar in the language of my choosing. And I think that power and that ability to generate is what has fired the imagination of.
Interesting. I want to touch on one part that you mentioned there about the data that it's trained on. So I remember my example about acoustic echo cancellation. It was about capturing the audio response of a room where you might get reflections off a wall, and that was all about capturing that data to then make the model smarter and more responsive to solving that problem. So how are large language models trained now, and what's the data that feeds into these large language models to make them what they are?
So there's a number of ways they can be trained. My own usage of large language models is mostly through using language models that produce text. So I wouldn't claim to be an expert on imagery or video, but you can just basically feed a whole lot of text into the model. You have to dissect each piece of text, so you chop it up into probably words or parts of words, and then they build what's called embeddings from. And then these embeddings are used to train the model, and that's where I will admit my knowledge. I'm not, my knowledge of machine learning is from quite a while. We're talking early 21st century. There's been, as I said, a lot of incremental advances since then. And basically you're pushing these vectors through a large network of doing arithmetic computations in big matrices. And then there's back propagation to correct errors until you get a signal coming out, which is mostly correct. And that's how you can generate language that sounds like it was written by a person with very high intelligence. What we have to remember is that this is not intelligence, and this is not some kind of person conversing with. It's actually just a statistical representation of the combined knowledge of humankind, and it's trying to guess what you want to hear. The reward function is basically, what does the user want to get from it? And so this is where it can hallucinate and start telling you things that aren't true. For example, it told me yesterday that I'd made a very astute observation. It said, "You're absolutely correct." It told me, and it turns out I wasn't. But that's the way it operates. It's very, it's sycophantic, even though it's a machine that has no feelings or intent. It often feels very sycophantic the way it interacts with you.
Yeah, and I've often been told it's a bit like it's been trained on the data of the entire internet up until a certain point, and it has access to the entire data that we have produced as a society across the last 20, 30 years, if you will. And that's all been used to train it, which means it's essentially been trained on publicly available data across a range of different sources. Is that how you understand the current large language models?
Publicly available, I think, is a bit of a stretch given how many copyrights have been violated. I think the case with OpenAI has been, let's hoover up everything we can, and let's be clear, Anthropic have done the same thing. Let's hoover up all the data we can get. Don't worry whether it's legal or not. We'll figure that out later. When people start to sue us, we'll figure out how we're going to deal with that. And the response has been mostly, let's get some laws changed, because copyrights was only invented 100 years ago, and maybe it's had its time. So there's a very strong lobby, and we're hearing these voices in Australia now as well, starting to say we need to reform copyright laws, which is a coded way of saying I need to make more money from taking your content. You can, of course, train the models on private data. So there's nothing stopping you, if you're running your own in-house model, on taking data that you own that is not available and using that to fine-tune public model, or to even build your own model from scratch. Resource.
Absolutely. I do have a question on that, actually. So I'm glad you touched on the potential for copyright issues, because I know there was a case, give me a moment, I'll find it. There was a case in late 2023 where the New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft for copyright infringement, alleging that millions of their articles were used without permission to train the models that now compete with their very service. And is that an example of what you're describing when you talk about the copyright issues?
Yeah, for sure. And the New York Times is big enough to do that. I think, though, where it's probably going to head is that you'll have class action, where you get a group of newspapers or a group of publications or authors get together, and I seem to remember there's something like this happening at the moment. It basically starts with someone in the legal profession who decides they want to launch a class action, and then they can find out who the plaintiffs are and collect all those people together who want to sign on, and go for one big class action so that everybody gets paid. And that I think is the real danger, because they have just ripped off so much work that if all these people came together under one class action, that's probably an existential threat to some of these.
Absolutely. And copyright's only one issue. The other one is indeed privacy. So I'm aware of the free tiers of most of these platforms, and not only in the context of large language models and these types of services, but also in general, any cloud-based services where there's often a free tier provided. Now, we'll dive into some of the details of that later in terms of what that means, but how does that influence privacy as well?
I think how it influences your privacy is largely dependent on the terms and conditions you signed up for, agreed to use the free tier. I have seen certainly the bigger providers have been quite transparent about their intentions to not make your data public. But I think it's possible through just making mistakes that some of your data could be exposed. I think more broadly, they say the internet never forgets. And there are certainly OSINT researchers who find out all manner of things about you by just looking through publicly available. I think that large language models in some ways will make it much easier for people to find out information about you without having to trawl through lots of open source intelligence or through pages of search results. That information now is able to be summarized, presented much faster.
Excellent. I've got something I would like to read out actually on that. So talking about typical types of terms and conditions that you might find in the standard cloud terms and service. And one of them is a worldwide royalty-free license to use, host, store, reproduce, modify, and create derivative works. Now, I understand why a provider might want to be able to host and store your data. My issue is around creating derivative works. And I know traditionally that was described as maybe a thumbnail view that you could see, and that was created a derivative. In the legal context, I read derivative works to mean being used to train AI models. Is that something that you can comment on?
Without knowing the specifics, it's hard to know. I would say it could include that. If the terms and conditions don't actually forbid it, then you can almost be certain they are doing it. But even if you were using the LLM for personal use and you've got a whole lot of questioning, I mean, I've done this. You use an LLM for a while, you accumulate a whole lot of conversations, and then you go back and you want to actually ask it a question that pertains to previous conversations you've had. Now, not all LLMs will do this. I know ChatGPT, for example, can tell you a lot about what sort of person. And it can do that because it's effectively taken all the previous things you've said and turned them into some kind of model, a small model that is effectively a derivative work of everything you previously said. Put that together and tell you things about the sort of person you are. And this is quite useful if you want to, for example, say, I need you to write something. I want you to use my voice or say it the way I would, based on previous conversations I've had where I've told you how I like to express myself. And it's very good.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's using your chats to make derivative works, as long as you are the beneficiary of the work.
Sure. And I know there was another famous case where some Samsung employees shared some of their source code, which was their secret source, with a free tier of a large language model. And it made the news for the potential for Samsung to have had significant damages as a result of them sharing that secret source code that could now potentially be used by a large language model provider to train their future models and potentially provide that same information to someone else using the system. How big of a risk is that for businesses?
I think it's really not so different to shadow IT, in that if you have this powerful technology that's highly desirable, then people are always looking for ways to productivity edge. They're going to use it. And you need to, I think as an organization, you need to front run. You need to figure out, what do my employees want to use this technology for? And how can I provide them access to it in a controlled way that we don't accidentally post our company onto the wrong platform with the wrong T's and C's, where we can't possibly call the data, or where it's exposed to people who are not supposed to see it. I think that's where you do need a chief data officer or a data and privacy officer to evaluate these platforms and make decisions, and then provide guidance to an organization on how they should best utilize the technology, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then provide guardrails and tooling to support.
Sure. And whilst we're on data in particular, you said there was one thing you said that sort of struck out at me, which was having a chief data officer and the way organizations, one, control, but two, govern their data. And I remember many years ago, data was seen as the advice for organizations was collect as much data as possible, and this is an asset that you should invest in understanding that data because it can help your business. Are we at a point with the cybersecurity landscape where data can be seen as a liability?
I think it's been that way for quite a while. I remember the catchphrase during the internet was that data is the new oil. Uh, I think later people actually changed that and said, no, actually data is more like uranium. It's in, it's great if you've got some. You can use it to do a lot of things. It's very useful. But you stack up too much of it, and it's toxic. And there are bad people who want to get their hands on it. And you need to be able to dispose of it safely and make sure that it's never coming back. And so there's a lot of parallels.
I like that analogy. That's a really good one.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think you can put too much data together and get critical mass. Who knows?
Very good. So I want to change topics a bit, Vaughan, and then just talk about this idea of sovereignty in the context of AI in particular, and what that might mean. And I'll start very generally. What does the concept of sovereignty mean for yourself, the business that you're in?
Yeah, so obviously Cydarm is an Australian owned and operated company. And something that's important to me as a citizen of Australia and a resident here is the idea of sovereignty, that we can control our future, that we can make decisions or elect democratically elected representatives who can make decisions for us without undue influence by foreign actors. And also the notion of being self-sufficient and being able to defend ourselves, feed ourselves. I think it's unrealistic to make everything here, but you do need to have some sovereign ability to an extent if you want to be viable at the nation. And I think one risk with new technology is that if we assume we can't build it here, if we assume that it's best built by foreigners, then we need to import all of that technology. And in the case of AI, there are people here building applications, okay? But the real value is not in the wrapper around the AI, the actual models themselves. And if those models are hosted offshore, if the hardware that runs them is hosted offshore, what you're doing is you're saying in that value creation that you're delivering to the end user, a massive part of that margin is going to go to an entity in California or in. So we need to think about what sort of a future we want in Australia and whether we're willing to let those margins disappear to offshore companies who provide the hardware, the infrastructure, the software, the models on top. Or do we want to retain some of that value, have the ability to host it locally? I think the second imperative is more of a national security imperative. We have some limited number of undersea cables we rely on for high-speed internet coming into Australia, links us with the world. And I think there's less than 10 cables. We already know adversaries can cut these cables anytime they want. And so even if we are hosting models locally, if they rely on foreign tech support to keep them up and running, we effectively don't have a fully sovereign capability. Those cables can be cut at any moment and there's no help.
Great description. And I enjoyed the way you articulated what sovereignty means to you. And I know the concept of sovereignty is it's a topic that I think needs to be discussed more. We certainly don't, it's a topic that is often politicized, which means it's very difficult to get a good, succinct discussion of it. And it's often one that also is influenced by the world today. Like when the concept of sovereignty was first described, it was all about having, like you said, control to operate within your borders and not being influenced by any other third parties. In today's interconnected world, there's so much interdependence on supplies, services, IT in particular, cloud storage and AI models are part of that. We've seen, I think one of the biggest data sovereignty acts in the world that has led the way being the EU's GDPR Act, and the impact that that has had on data. That next frontier now is the challenge of describing, well, what does it mean in the context of AI? And I know it has been discussed. So I think we've had some of our Australian tech founders and quite famous founders. I think Scott Farquhar talked about, has chimed in on this debate. Whilst we've also had others. Also, we've also had others like Simon Chris and Dr. Troy Nelson, who have defined a pathway of what they think is a truly sovereign capability, and going all the way down to our foundational models. Now, they're on the journey to build what they're describing as Australia's first sovereign cloud, and they've defined 4 foundational layers for what they believe is a sovereign capability in Australia. And part of that is hosting in Australia. It's also creating our own foundational model in Australia, where we understand the data sources that feed into that model, and they're ethically sourced, and it understands the Australian context. So I wanted to invite your thoughts into, I guess, that particular component, the importance of having an Australian foundational model.
I'm not sure how an Australian foundational model would differ that much to some of the large open source models out there already. I'll be honest. If you wanted to only put Australian data into it, maybe you could build an Australian model. If you wanted to avoid copyright concerns, I think an Australian model would be more about what you leave out as opposed to what you put in. You can see why there's value in doing. I think the real opportunity though for an Australian hosted model is firstly to have it hosted here and have it supported by Australian technologists and available without relying on foreign parties. Ideally, we even have hardware fabs that hardware, but I think we're a long way at this point. Often the neutrality or the cultural appropriateness of the model depends on the layers around it. So for example, when DeepSeek was first released, so this is a model hosted in People's Republic of China, it was actually built by a hedge fund. And they built it because they wanted to be able to make smarter investment decisions, right? It was not built for any sort of propaganda purpose. They in fact, allegedly trained it by distilling information from ChatGPT. So they ripped off a bunch of American technology to train it up. But what happened was when it gained popularity, when they made it public, of course, the government made it very clear that you're not allowed to have this model tell people things that would break social harmony through People's Republic of China perspective. And so DeepSeek actually had controls added to the outside of it, some kind of watchdog that could detect if there was a conversation about a sensitive topic, one of the 5 poisons or whatever ideological thing they want to suppress, whatever conversation. I would actually cut the conversation off and just reply and say, I'm not going to talk about that. And so you could ask it about Tiananmen Square, and it would actually start producing text, and then the text would suddenly vanish and be replaced by a message saying, we're not going to talk about this, or it didn't happen or something. So, but then you can download the DeepSeek model itself and Quen from Alibaba. These are freely downloadable. And it's just a bunch of numbers in a data file. Now, whether someone has poisoned the training data with specific things these days, it's possible. But really, the model itself doesn't have strong opinions. It's when people start giving it instructions, I want it to behave this way, or putting filters in front of it. I think that's when you can undue influence.
Sure. So there is a risk of a bias there, depending on the way the wrappers or guardrails that may be put around it.
Certainly, and that's implementation dependent. I will say though, if you started with something like DeepSeek, and then you had a government mandate that you have to retrain it only on approved data sources, or you have to feed it special propaganda that changes the way the model behaves, you could in fact poison foundational model, give it bias. But I think we're still in the early days of that. That's
Very interesting. How can we improve, I guess, from a sovereignty perspective, those applications, that application layer for large language models? Is that I guess, a more important element to solve in terms of sovereignty, or do you think the foundational layer is more important?
I think you have to look at the whole value chain, all the way from hardware up. And we have to be realistic and say, we're a small company. We don't have the same mature technology as other countries. So we have to be realistic about what we can achieve. So, I mean, the United States relies heavily on Taiwan for semiconductors. So we're not about to develop a semiconductor industry that can parallel Taiwan. Like, we used to have one, but it's way too late to catch up now. It's still an endeavor worth starting. But we do want to have at least people who understand that technology at a deep level, so that if we were going to go into the semiconductor business, we would be able to. Let me rephrase. Australia does have sovereign semiconductor fabs, and it's making a resurgence. I don't know whether, in fact, I'm almost sure that they don't have the processes yet to be able to build the type of hardware that NVIDIA builds for AI. We're a long way off that. But we need to keep building up in that direction. And I think that's where a lot of governments are helpful. Hopefully, investors, long time horizons, and a lot of patience will help there as well. Moving up the value chain, I think, though, being able to understand how these recurrent neural networks work, being technologists trained in just the fundamentals of how to build a system training AI is very useful. Having practitioners who understand how to use AI, so software developers, understanding the underlying database technology, how do you make it efficient, how do you build systems, and then at the higher layer, how do you build the guardrails and the security mechanisms? Obviously, something you know a lot about. The security mechanisms that will prevent these models from being turned against us or compromised.
So we've talked about privacy and control of data. What can businesses do if they want to try to take back some more control and not be so reliant on cloud providers from overseas? What are the options available to businesses?
It's a good question, and I think businesses should be starting to make contingency plans now, because we all know that OpenAI runs at a massive loss, and they do this because they want to try and permeate every aspect of business. But we also know that these businesses will need to monetize at some point. And so what's going to happen is the cost is going to go right up. And if you have readjusted your business processes to rely entirely on one of these large public AI models, you're suddenly going to find that they are putting the squeeze on. You can run your own models. I would totally encourage people to play with the technology.
And before you continue, I might just interrupt if I can, Vaughan. So putting the squeeze on you, what do you mean in that respect? Is that about many of these services right now are being provided at a relatively cheap cost, and at some point that price will invariably go up?
I think that OpenAI is running out of funding options. There's only so much private equity they can absorb before investors start demanding they make a return, and they will have to break even at least, or even profit. And the only way they can do that is either they can do it by reducing their costs, which is very hard to do technologically. We know they use vast CPU resources, vast data centers full of specialized GPU hardware, or they can just pass that cost on to the end consumer, which is business and individuals. And so I think we need to be very careful about which are the highest ROI use cases that you would continue to use if the price went up, and be aware of that price sensitivity. And also take steps to make a contingency plan for if the public AI providers become too expensive. How can you find an alternative?
Very interesting. And that's really important for most businesses, and in particular those that are, I'll say, consumers of the AI. So they've got a decent understanding of what it can do for them and have potentially changed their businesses to, in some cases, replace people or replace processes with that AI component there, thinking they are saving significant amounts of resources and giving them their business a competitive advantage. Many, including myself, I had not realized that I guess the costs for companies like OpenAI to run this service was running at a loss. So it's quite eye-opening. So thank you for sharing.
It's running at an insane loss. Like, we're talking billions of dollars, and they've been able to sustain this by continually claiming that AGI is just around the corner. So that is very exciting for investors, piling with another $50 billion, $100 billion. I think the latest paper was they wanted to get the US government to underwrite loans so that they will become a guarantor for loans that OpenAI would make. We do when we'll invest. No one will buy equity anymore. Then you get debt instead to fund your business. But ultimately, there's a cash crunch coming where someone's going to call it that the emperor has no clothes, and they're going to have to find a way to make ends meet. And so some things you can do, we don't need to be running these 400 billion parameter models to do simple tasks or very specialized tasks. You can get by with a much smaller model and get similar quality or good enough results on a fraction of the expense. I'll give you an example. I have a spare Mac, high-end MacBook with a decent amount of RAM and a GPU, which is ostensibly for running these large calculations. And that Mac can't run a 70 billion parameter model, but it can quite easily run a 3 billion parameter model. And that actually can produce pretty decent results. Might not be as good as a public model, but if it's good enough for a particular application, and if you have enough of these resources around for specific tasks, then you'll have very specific task-focused agents do one thing and do it really well. I think that's the future we're looking towards.
Yeah, right. And I guess providing an analogy to that is not too dissimilar from the way businesses might hire staff. You're not always going to get a generalist that can do a whole lot of things okay. You're going to hire people that specialize in a particular area and can do that job really, really well. Is that a similar concept in the realms of AI solutions that are out there?
Absolutely. If you're running in a small business, you often do need to find unicorn people who are multi-talented, but in a large enough business, you find someone who's an expert in simply one thing, and then you find other experts who are experts in other things. It's the way we think these models are going to stay financially viable.
I really like that analogy. Thank you. Just continuing on that topic in terms of what businesses can do, you mentioned utilizing an old MacBook or something like that. If a business wanted to go on that journey of self-hosting their own large language models, is that possible? And what can businesses do today, right now?
100%. I wouldn't recommend putting on an old MacBook, giving that by way of an experiment that I've done recently. You can find data centers where you can rack and stack your own hardware if you want to go that route. There are actually providers locally that will provide. There are actually Australian cloud providers already who you can rent hardware from. They do even offer GPU hardware if you want to use hardware acceleration. So there are options out there. I think if you're sufficiently large enough, bare metal is probably your best option. especially if you're going to invest in GPU hardware, then it is quite expensive to rent still, and you might be better off investing in. Having said that, you need to have people who have the expertise to be able to set that. But it's not as hard as it used to be. It is quite easy now using something like Ollama to simply download some software, pull a model from Hugging Face, and then just run it, and it just works.
Yeah, right. So what might be some of the pitfalls to taking that approach to getting that bare metal and almost self-administering your own environment?
You need to invest in reliability engineers who can keep it up and running. You might need to build some kind of interface on it. You're going to have all the usual security concerns. A large public cloud provider or utility AI provider and hire top security people and build it once for everybody to get the same benefit from security. Whereas if you're doing it in your company, you've got to find your own secure app developers or security people and you secure your own. It doesn't scale quite as well. But having spoken to people who moved from, for example, just public utility cloud to self-hosted on bare metal, it's actually way cheaper.
Yeah, right. So it obviously comes with additional amount of complexity and risks that you're now, I guess, insourcing as opposed to outsourcing. And that's obviously got its own security challenges. Are you able to describe some of those security challenges that companies that might have the ambition to take that burden on, where they may not realize some of the considerations that they need to make from a security perspective?
Yeah, so it's all the usual boring stuff. You need authentication, you need access control, you need auditing, all that usual security stuff. AI security is not that different to normal application security. Probably the one big difference is because AI is non-deterministic and you can literally prompt it with words to do things, and you're mixing instructions with data, you've got this added risk that if you have uncontrolled input coming into your AI, and then you've got a non-deterministic process that can interpret that input, attempt to do what you want it to do, and then that process also has the ability by MCPs or actuators to send data out of the system, then you have real potential for a data breach or abuse if you have those three factors. And the reason, to give you an example, if you're receiving emails and then having AI read your emails for you and maybe go and gather context from some databases that you have and then present you with a summary, answer questions for you, it sounds pretty innocuous, but people can either put in the email or in attachments emails, they can put in special prompts that will override your system prompt and get the AI to do things you didn't want it to do. And then when you've got access to sensitive private data, the AI can gather that data together, bundle it nicely, and if you've got that outbound path, send it to the attacker. And that's been successfully done even against the big public cloud providers. So I think that there's probably just some extra steps you have to take to make sure you're not lining up those three conditions and exposing yourself to breach.
Yeah, wow, very insightful. That was going to be one of my questions about how AI has changed the cybersecurity landscape for both potential attackers and on the defensive side as well. So that's quite a chilling example, and I think from a personal perspective, how would a business understand if that has happened, if they've invested time and effort into setting up their AI to triage their emails and do a whole lot of smart things that they think is adding value? How would a company even realize that something like that would occur?
All the usual, my answer. So an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, as they say. You're far better off just configuring your AI so that you're not exposed to those kinds of threats. So locking down outbound network pathways and not allowing it to connect with the internet is probably a really smart thing to do when you're dealing with a non-deterministic technology. And then being careful what you actually submit to the AI. So I wouldn't be sending unfiltered email into the AI and then letting it rummage around in my private file system. I think that's taking massive risks. And then basically the rest of it is just looking like any other application security type process, which is really how are you auditing it? You have the right kind of detection rules set up to detect when the unexpected happens, and do you have a response process in place? And of course, sufficient access control that you're not inadvertently exposing, from the point of view of insider threat, you're not taking all of your company data and putting it into one pool, in one model where people who are not supposed to have access can see private.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I know as a business owner and someone who's been in the tech industry for quite some time, we're often sold the hype and the promise of what AI can do, and things like agentic AI, which is often sold as something that could do all these things that we mentioned, could almost create draft emails and be monitoring your inbox to do that email triage and provide responses for you. It's often a bit it's a bit sobering to hear, I guess, the other side of that, to understand that these systems are still non-deterministic and you can't always rely on the outputs, and they're often creating a new sort of a new surface for attackers to try to attack.
Absolutely. Impacts this.
And what would you say to perhaps some of the less tech-savvy business owners out there that are perhaps buying into some of the hype of what AI can do, and want to stay on that cutting-edge curve of technology adoption, and they're investing hard in that, but they may not realize some of the additional risks associated with that? Like, do you have any advice for those people?
Yeah, I'd say get expert advice is probably the best thing. If you don't understand the technology enough to do it yourself, you need to find someone who can provide you with that advice, help you avoid bad choices.
Very good. And I know, on touching on that same topic, AI seems to be a lot of rhetoric around AI and its impact has been about, people's jobs and know-how and knowledge is being replaced by such tools. Do you see that that context sort of play out in your space?
It's a hard one. I don't see AI as replacing jobs. I see it replacing tasks, or making tasks faster. But even the leaders in AI, the big providers have changed their tune a bit, and they're now saying that AI needs close. So, as a person who writes code, as a software developer, I might be doing less time actually writing code, because the AI can write code much better than me. It does it faster. It makes no mistakes, or it makes no syntactic mistakes, very few. But what I spend my time doing instead is describing in detail what I want, because it can't guess what I want, and it often makes a mess of it if I don't give it precise instructions, and then very, very carefully reviewing the output to make sure it is what I wanted. And so I think the nature of work is changing. Will it make us more productive? Hopefully, yes. But obviously to get that productivity gain, some of the tasks that you spend your time on will change. So you go more from doing a thing to being a supervisor, this agent doing a thing. And that requires a change in skill set. If you're not good at describing what you want, you're going to struggle to use it. If you're not good at reviewing code, for example, you're going to struggle to use it. So I think that the nature of work will change, and if you can adapt, we have a future where there'll be massive productivity gains and abundance. But in the short term, there'll be a strong transition.
And in particular around that risk component, I'm hearing you say the most important part of this is being able to understand how AI is working, what tasks you use it for, and where the potential risks are.
Yeah, exactly. Just understanding what it can and can't do. And as I mentioned at the start of the conversation, it's a jagged frontier, and it's changing constantly. There are shifts happening. Something that wasn't good at last week, it might be a breakthrough, and now it's good at this one particular task, or someone's built an application or a model to do this task really well. And other things, last time I checked, still can't figure out how many R's are in the word strawberry. So, completely wrong. I saw it. I was actually using it. I was using AI the other day to do a simple long multiplication question. I was showing someone how to do long multiplication. It got the answer completely wrong. Completely wrong. You can't tell me it's got PhD level intelligence. It's very good at some things and just completely unreliable at others.
Absolutely. So to summarize, we've explored a range of different topics around AI and around large language models. We've gone through some privacy concerns. We've gone through some security concerns. We've explored sovereignty. And thank you for your input to all those, Vaughan. It's been most valued. And I guess in summary, I'd want to ask you a question as a closing remark. If you were an SME in Australia today, what is the first thing you would do to address what we've discussed today?
Be curious, learn as much as you can about AI, find ways that you can utilize it. Find out what are your own acceptability criteria for where it meets bar in quality and productivity gain. But also just be careful that you're not over-reliant on it or using it in a context where you might cause yourself privacy or security.
Great advice. Thank you, Vaughan. And I think that's advice for both any individual and for companies, because it resonates across the board for anyone on their professional journey, whether it's a student or professionals alike, and likewise for businesses, both small and large. So thank you.